And we are live just in the nick of time. I have to move all of these toggles, as you know, to get everything set up. I must have to move probably a dozen different buttons to coordinate things properly in about 45 seconds. So I think it worked out. Anyhow, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an institute for the humanities and alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. This broadcast, thanks to your donations and recording, is day 284 of the project. Thought I had a sneeze coming on. I still feel that sneeze coming on, but in any case, it's behaving itself. The nasal passages are. Anyway, we're looking at utopian socialism today and then Marxism. And all of this growing out of both the mechanical and the industrial revolution as laid out by H.G. Wells, making our way through his outline of history, as we do here at the Institute. One of our great contributions, an area where we're truly unique, is what we call the project, which is our unified curricula, which brings together both our enrolled students here in class in Connecticut and online, our private students, our alumni who have moved on with their lives but wish to keep up the study of the humanities, our monthly seminarians, as well as our larger learning community, the more informal learning community on BitChute, Rumble, and so forth. All of us are coordinated in our studies, and this is part of the great work of educational restoration that we're about here at ApocatastasisInstitute. So won't you join us? If you go down below in the description, you can see a sublink to the projects page where I explain this much more thoroughly. And appropriate for these daily recordings and broadcasts, you can access the text in PDF of the outline of history. By the time this summer has come and gone, we will have a working draft of the 4-week courses of poetry, as well as the outline of history broken up over the course of a year, in addition to some supplemental selections. This will mark a great stride in the development of the project, and indeed a great stride in the development of our universal curricula. The outline of history, the poems are meant to be are not meant to be the final word on any of this, but what they allow us to do in a regular, consistent fashion indefinitely is to approach the Western humanities again and again yearly. And this allows for any number of discussions and private studies to spin off. So, with that being said, let's take a look at our screen share and get our advertisement in and get on with the history of Europe. We've looked at so many things lately, the revolutions of 1848 and on the mechanical industrial revolutions, and of course the concert of Europe, which will might pop its head up today some. But the one advertisement appropriate to my initial remarks is concerning enrollment and matriculation. And another summer project this week, in fact, I will be updating our course catalog, but this is still certainly usable for the information herein. And you can find out all about the amazing swath of classes we have here at Apocatastasis's, not just taught by myself, but other more competent scholars, Adam Myers, Vandana Rataria, Lorenzo Malawane, our Mikhail Fisher for consulting and some teaching on child psychology. So all of that is contained here, and it will also feature staff biographies. So there's Dr. Fisher, Professor Myers, Vandana, that guy, and then all sorts of other good stuff. So you can access that on our enrollment and matriculation sub-page. Okay, let's get some nice morning music going on, and we'll hop right into Wilfred Owen and then get into Karl Marx. And our background will have to be sufficiently labory. Well, I don't know about that, but Sufficiently sunny? Well, how about sunny mornings? Let's see what we're getting here. Okay, I can live with this. Can you live with this? I think so. Okay. So, yeah, let's get on with socialisms here. Now, I just spoke that in the plural because in the 19th century, and H.G. Wells lays this out, the labor topic is the topic on everyone's minds. Here we have an image of Robert Owen's New Harmony with a quote. There is but one mode by which man can possess in perpetuity all the happiness which his nature is capable of enjoying. That is by the union and cooperation of all for the benefit of each. And I just finished this very morning Thomas Holland's book Dominion, looking at the legacy of Christianity, principally in the West. And I can't help reading this quote in the 19th century, noticing how far secularism has advanced. And yet, whether it's secularism in a broad sense or Owenism or Marxism, and we're looking at these secular movements concerning labor, jagging off of Tom Holland's book, and I believe his public name is Tom, so I don't mind using the informal version there. I think that's how he's published under. It is interesting, to see the legacy of Christianity here, even in a very secularized sense. That was kind of my main takeaway from the Dominion book by Tom Holland, is the enduring aspect of certain parts of Christianity, even that have jumped the ship and entered into new communities and new time periods, and one of which from Christianity is that universal idea that in Christianity anyone can be saved. And so that leads to all number of subsequent conclusions regarding human rights and comportment and so forth. And so that trickles by the 19th century, anyhow, of having shucked its religious origins, that idea of universalism and brotherhood, two separate ideas, that does carry on, especially in what we call the left and the labor movement. And we'll see that both in Owenism, maybe a bit more on the human rights aspect, and then in Marxism and variations thereof concerning, a universal ideology that can be almost switched out nation to nation without any real hiccups or whatnot, right? I mean, you can be a Chinese communist, you can be a Russian communist, you can be a Brazilian communist, as soon as you could be a Christian. Both of those dispensations, so to speak, are theoretically open to everyone. So, so interesting to see the continuing legacy of Christianity in a very different set of clothes, let's say. Okay, so we're going to start, of course, with the utopian. And so, unlike most of these classes, I will not begin with the book, but we'll get to the book when we get to Marxism. And we'll get to our H.G. Wells. So this is called A World in Miniature, Robert Owen's Socialist Utopia, from a website called Radical Tea Towel. And I'm just looking at this line of tabs up here. So World War II, 80 years, tea towels, aprons, bags. So that has to do with tea, games and books. I'm going to have to explore this. I think I've been on this website before. And I made a similar marveling at some of the topics there. So anyway, here's Robert Owen. And I should, be very explicit here. The Marxists had no time at all for Owen's utopian socialism. They called themselves the scientific socialists, and that was very much a dig at the type of what the Marxists called utopian socialism of the likes of Owen. So there was not, as the left is so fond of verbing, there was not a how do you say? It was not a happy family in terms of labor discussions in the 19th century. Everyone has their own little factions. Okay, born in Wales on this day, whatever that day is, 1771, Robert Owen took socialism to these United States. Quote, the present arrangement of society is the most antisocial, impolitic, and irrational that can be devised, unquote. The relationship between Wales and America has been in the news during the last few years thanks to the high-profile takeover of the Wrexham Football Club by Hollywood stars Robin McKenney and Ryan Reynolds, of all people. But the history of the Welsh-American connections goes back much farther. In fact, back to the early 19th century, it was a Welshman who introduced socialism to these United States. And, in a sense, this is, part of the Anglosphere. I don't know now with Muhammad down at the gas station and Shaniqua down at the drugstore, you wouldn't imagine it. But you go back to the early 19th century, revolution or no revolution, America very much was a WASP country. And so a man from Wales to come to the United States, in a sense, was, one British man visiting his cousins still. And we want to keep that in mind. So New Harmony, this is New Harmony. This is an illustration of New Harmony in Indiana, his utopian perfect city, Owen's city. Okay. Robert Owen was born in Newtown, Montgomery Shire, on this day in 1771. I want to know what day that is. He was from a middling family in Georgian-era Wales. He was not poor, but not at all rich. Owen's dad was an ironmonger, and his mum was from a farming family. Right. So maybe not quite the money of Karl Marx's family, but nevertheless, not from the proletariat, interestingly, in either instance. Owen apprenticed as a drapier in Lincolnshire before moving to Manchester, the heart of the Industrial Revolution, at the age of 18. Recognized as a talent amongst Britain's new ruling class of bourgeois capitalists. We know bourgeois means people that are of the city, meaning to get in a bit more depth, you need to both ingratiate yourself to your next door neighbor because he's your possible customer, and view him as a competitor. And this has profound implications on bourgeois societies. And of course, regardless of the amount of money in your pocket, one of the increasing realities you see at this point up until today is that the bourgeois thinking grows and grows and grows to the point that we might say that we are all bourgeois, be we billionaires or bums on the street. We all have the bourgeois pretensions and the bourgeois psychology, not the least of which is paranoia. Owen quickly rose to the ranks of the textile sector, the most important in Britain's new industrial economy. Remember, Britain has access, as we looked at a few weeks ago, to India after the American Revolution, or at about that time, I should say. And then that will continue for various reasons into the 19th century. So you have cotton, you have wool, perhaps, in England, right? You got to do something with it. And so you focus on textiles. In 1792, at the same time as social revolution was transforming France, right? That's the height of the French Revolution. Owen was made a manager of the Piccadilly Mill in Manchester at just 21. Here's an image of the French Revolution storming of the Bastille that we spent some time on. Oh, are these towels? I think these are actually towels. Hold on. That's so strange. What a weird conglomeration of things. Because I noticed that here. Okay, so this is the Radical Tea Towel Company. And I noticed here, I don't know if you can see it, but there's stitching. I noticed that this had to have been a banner of some sort. This could be the size of a handkerchief even. Look at this. So this is a towel. And then they have an advertisement for the storming of the Bastille tea towel. I don't see stitching on this, but I do suspect that this is a speaking of textiles, this is actually literally selling tea towels with historical scenes on them, which is most unique. But the industrialization in Britain depended upon the violent impoverishment of the working class, stealing common land and forcing them into cities to work as industrial laborers in dangerously unsafe factories. What you see underlying there, the stealing of common land, is an event we call politely the enclosure movement or the theft of the commons, less politely, when the British lords privatized grazing lands. And you and I, who've only known private land ownership our entire lives, we've only known no trespass signs and no loitering signs, might find it absolutely remarkable that prior to about the 16th century, it does predate the Reformation and picks up steam through the 19th century. There are hundreds, I believe, certainly dozens, I believe hundreds of acts, ACTS, acts in the British Parliament about this, pushing this theft of the commons. So it's very hard to imagine that there were actually large swaths of land in England prior to this theft of the commons process, which took a few hundred years, where anyone could live. You could graze your crops, you could graze your animals freely. You couldn't grow crops there necessarily for commercial reasons, but you could have gardens and things. Absolutely unbelievable that you would have common or free land that the little people, the little guy, could take advantage of. And this was slowly, by the greed of the English ruling class, slowly strangled out of English life, and this forced people into the cities. And this really sets off this enclosure movement or the theft of the commons, really sets off a whole array of disturbances in English history, which continue, and I would say even in the Anglosphere, in all English-speaking societies. In fact, someday I will perhaps someday I ought to do an entire essay on this, because there's not nearly enough attention given to the enclosure movement and how that damages trust within the Anglosphere and the relationship of the rulers to the ruled, and the adversarial nature of that. So anyway, that's the enclosure movement, the stealing of common land. The legacy of that, if you wanna know, like, what's, like, the legacy of the enclosure movement, or, like, what's the here, how about this? What's the last example of common land, of how it kind of was before the British lords stole all the land and made everything private? Here in New England, I think we have the very last echo of that in what we call our town greens. In New England, it's very common in the center of town to have a kind of a large stretch of grass, and you usually be in the center of town. And nowadays, it's pretty privatized in the sense that if you want to do anything there with a group of people, you have to get a permit and all this jazz. But actually, that's the very, very, very last example of common lands. And even here in New Milford, Connecticut, up until about 1900, our green was a true green. It wasn't just a pretty place that the Chamber of Commerce could put their restaurants around and have fairs on, which is basically all that the greens are used for now. Prior to even 100 years ago, here in New England, you had the last echoes of the common land. And what you would do is anyone had the right to graze their animals on the town green. And it was a shit show, quite literally, and it smelled bad. And I have a book here on the history of the town. But you could do that. And of course, earlier, the town greens would also be used for drilling militia in New England. So those town greens, which you have your fairs on here in New England in the summer, those actually are the very last echoes of a world where land was not completely privatized and everyone owned the land and could do what they pleased on the land freely. Unbelievable. Anyhow, Robert Owen was one of the few British capitalists to care about the misery which his class was daily causing for the majority of people. Indeed, Owen lived in the time when the non-aristocratic bourgeois in Britain was still a youthful force in history, capable of critical and creative political thought rather than just profit and self-preservation. So they were hungry, as we say. The non-noble capitalists were hungry. They had all sorts of ideas, that is to say, and they had all sorts of enthusiasm. They had not become the mummified caste they would become. All right, let's take a look here at some of Owen's reforms. At New Lanark, free education was provided for workers' children and the workers themselves. Corporal punishment, widely used to discipline the workforce of modern capitalism, was banned, as was child labor. H.G. Wells, in this day's reading of the Outline of History, remarks not that child labor was banned during the British Factory Act, but rather that someone had thought that child labor under 9, that it was a step in the right direction to get rid of child labor under 9 years of age, which shows you how stark some of the depredations were. And Owen's company store sold goods to workers at discounted rates. Owen's increasingly socialistic business practices were based on the belief that individual outcomes were determined by social conditions, not intrinsic virtue or lack thereof. So if you want to know, in modern political Anglosphere discourse, one of the biggest differences between liberals and conservatives would have to do with this very point here, that individual outcomes are largely based on social conditions, not individual virtue. So that means, if you tend to see yourself as a liberal or a leftist, you would tend to see bad behaviors and good behaviors in society as the reflection of the living conditions that the people have to live under. Whereas if you would see yourself right-wing or so-called conservative, you would tend to put much more emphasis on individuals' agency, regardless of environmental factors. When we teach the high schoolers some basics about modern politics, that's one of the main points. From whence stems virtue and vice? Let's say, is it environment or the soul, if you like? Owen and others become convinced that the New Lanark experiment could be replicated, that it might even transform the world. Okay, here we have Thomas Paine, a radical from an earlier generation. My country is the world, and my religion is to do good. If you want a good socialist paean to Thomas Paine, you could look up Dick Gognan's song, Tom Paine's Bones. I don't know if he wrote that song, but he has a good cover of it. Tom Paine's Bones, a celebration of the radicalism of the man. So then in 1824, Owen pulls up stakes and moves to Indiana, where he founds New Harmony. New Harmony was to be based on egalitarian principles of equal rights and equal duties, common property, and public education. The idealism of Owen's project attracted all sorts. One of his sons called a heterogeneous collection of radicals. One participant recalled of New Harmony that, quote, we had a world in miniature, which is the name of this article. We had enacted the French Revolution over again, unquote. Owen believed that the model of a cooperative socialist community might save industrial society from fissures which capitalism had created by demonstrating a better way of life. In 1825, Owen spoke to Congress in favor of socialist alternatives. It was the first time socialism has been put forward publicly in these United States, 1825. But in the end, New Harmony didn't work out, and Owen returned to Britain, where he died in Wales in 1858. So there were internal problems with New Harmony. One of the things you have when you have a commune or an intentional community of any sort, it could be a sports team, it could be a church, it could be some sort of youth group, whatever. One of the things when you have a type of egalitarian society and a voluntary society, all you libertarians pay attention here, is that it falls apart because some people do all the work, right? If you you those of you who've assisted at churches, it's like the same person putting out coffee every week, the same person doing the ushering, the same person shoveling the pathways. Um, and nobody steps up. So when you have egalitarian societies, and they're voluntary, most people just sit on their ass and let probably 5% of the population do all the work. That eventually causes resentments and factionalization. And then what also happened were external circumstances at New Harmony. There were two devastating fires, and basically all these people had pitched in their money, to get this thing up and going. So they didn't have any liquid capital to just keep rebuilding after these fires. So it fell apart. The supporters of capitalist individualism claimed that Owenite socialism had failed because it misunderstood the essentially selfish nature of human beings. But in reality, Owen's well-meaning vision of social transformation was simply too small scale and isolated to survive. Even if one of the Owenite communities had worked locally, it could not have transformed society as a whole. I think within New Harmony and Lanark as well, I mean, you very much have, this is why it's called utopian, I suppose. You very much have that idea that we see in American history, the city on the hill, which of course comes from St. Matthew's Gospel, which we're reading through in Holy Mass this time of the year. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. Do not put your light under a bushel basket. That kind of gets secularized here in America. And the idea or the appeal, however, transcends the religious scaffolding, much like brotherhood and universalism does for Owen and Karl Marx. These are fundamentally, or I should say originally, Christian ideas that kind of jump the ship. And there is something inherently appealing, right? I'm going to go over here and start this amazing thing, and it's going to be so amazing, whether that's your Plymouth plantation or your New Harmony. It's going to be so amazing that it's going to change the whole world. It will be a marvel, and everyone's just going to imitate us. Remarkably attractive. And I think especially to the American character, which fundamentally is a character of divorce and taking your ball, and I can't deal, and I'm out of here, and you'll come around. I'm doing a whole essay right now on what I call divorce, but I don't just mean that in a marital sense at all. But I mean the tendency that we have historically in America to divorce, and I think how that's been exacerbated to divorce, to split up our communities in a number of ways. So I mean divorce in a very broad sense, but there's something very fundamental in the American character of taking your ball and bitching and going home and splitting up a community. You can tell my thoughts on the matter, but there is that. I mean, as someone who's taken his ball and gone home plenty himself, I suppose ApocatastasisInstitute is one working out of that. There's also, and this in relationships. Well, I'm going to, after I leave my trophy wife, I'm gonna, be such a success that they're gonna be kicking themselves or whatever the case may be. We do that, right? When we do that, and there is something very attractive about what do we call that? Like I told you so, or wait till you see what I become, whatever. The child who's told he'll never amount to a hill of beans, and he becomes whatever this world considers successful. There is something of satisfaction in that if you've made that come to pass and you're able to gloat over those whom you've seceded from. Okay, so some musings there, and now we're going to change the camera and we're going to get on with our outline of history. So that's Robert Owen, a utopian socialist, but the other and what will become more prominent outworking of socialism will be the scientific socialists, or what we call now Marxists, and those more technocratic sorts. So I'm going to change the camera, and we will continue here. So this is a little bit different, this broadcast today, because I usually do the Wells book first. Here we go. Take a look here. And there we go. So we're looking here in the very long and detailed chapter, the 19th century, and we're going to begin in the guts of part 2 here, right here. And so there's a long meditation, as you would necessarily have to have, about um, about utopian thinking in the West. He goes back to Thomas More's Utopia, the book. We could talk about Bacon's New Atlantis, which I referenced, which is well worth reading, along with More's book, to see the development of this idea. There's a discussion of the mechanical and industrial revolutions, which you've looked at before. The mechanical, as he uses it, refers to changes in engineering, changes in metallurgy, the strength and smelting of metal to make stronger and stronger metals, which you can get bigger and bigger buildings from, and also the invention of sheet metal in particular in the 19th century, which makes boilers possible, and other things of that nature, where you can get steam engines, right? People had thought of steam engines before, but they did not have really the way to contain in a sealed way the power of steam. I mean, there actually is a car. Someone actually invented a car around the time of the American Revolution. I'm not making that up. It was a steam car. But again, it was so inefficient that it could never be scaled up. Just like you've probably seen like flying machines from Leonardo da Vinci and things like that. I mean, people had these ideas, but they just did not have the metals, and they didn't have the fibers and things to get these ideas developed. Now, the other revolution that H.G. Wells lays out is the Industrial Revolution, and that has to do with the relationship of labor and the economy. So that's how he differentiates the mechanical from the Industrial Revolution. And then he really goes back in time talking about the Roman Empire, and he contrasts ancient labor practices to to modern ones. And I'll just read this bit here because it's worthwhile. He's building up to Marxism. This was true. Let's get a beautiful Apocatastasis's straight edge here. This was true as such ancient industries as agriculture and mining, as it was of the newest metallurgical processes. For plowing, sowing, and harvesting, swift machines come forward to do the work of scores of men. Here, America led the old world. The Roman civilization was built upon cheap and degraded human beings. Modern civilization is being rebuilt, he's speaking in the present tense, upon cheap mechanical power. For 100 years, power had been getting cheaper and labor dearer. If for a generation or so machinery has had to wait its turn in the mine, it is simply because for a time men were cheaper than machinery. I think these are very prescient considerations, especially with AI and robotics. We'll get back to that soon enough. In Northumberland and Durham, in the early days of coal mining, they were so cheaply esteemed that it was unusual to hold inquests on the bodies of men killed in mine disasters. Trade unionism was needed to alter that state of affairs. And he goes on quite a bit. Now he gets into, this is H.G. Wells, the author. He gets into certain socialistic ideas, and this is very much appropriate to my morning as I finished up Tom Holland's book Dominion, looking at the legacy of Christianity in the West. And so here we have a similar observation. From the days of the first Christian propaganda, popular education had been smoldering in Europe, just as it had smoldered in Asia, wherever Islam had set its foot. Because of the necessity of making the believer understand a little of the belief by which he is saved, and enabling him to read a little in the sacred books in which his belief is conveyed. Christian controversies with their competition for adherents plowed the ground for a harvest of popular education. So there's a few things that he gets into here. So you have, again, another Christian idea that becomes secularized, universal knowledge, universal brotherhood, um, the idea that anybody can comprehend this system. I mean, these are quite interesting to see this phenomena of secularism moving along. And then he brings things home here to our study this morning. And you can read this book along with us day to day and join our learning community here by simply downloading the outline of history from our project site freely, available down below in the description. By the middle of the 19th century, skipping ahead, Karl Marx, a German Jew of great scholarly attainments, was pointing out that the organization of the working classes by the steadily concentrating group of capitalist owners was developing a new social classification to replace the more complex class systems of the past. Property, so far as it was power, was being gathered together into relatively few hands. The hands of the big rich men, as Marx might say, or some Marxist street singer, the capitalist class. Whilst there was a great mingling of workers with little or no property, whom we call the expropriated or proletariat, a misuse of this word, Wells notes, who were bound to develop a common class consciousness of the conflict of their interests with those of the rich men, until the rich men figured out how to invent TikTok and distract the workers from developing any sort of consciousness, much less class consciousness. Differences in education tradition between the various older social elements were in the process of being fused into the new class of the expropriated, seemed for a time to contradict his sweeping generalizations. And I should point out that, not only did Marx not envision, understandably, something like TikTok to distract the working classes, but also the labor conditions which he had to witness in England, they did improve, and so that did cause quite a bit of growing pains for the scientific socialists, or the Marxists as they came to be called. Right, when Marx is writing, bums are sleeping on the street, he has to step over children sleeping on the street to get famously to the British Library. And, eventually that does ameliorate. And so you have to take your critique into account as well. And that leads to other developments. Also in the English sphere, solutions like Marx's revolution never really obtained and never really got much traction in the very modern Anglosphere. These classes, Marx says, who were linked at first by nothing but a common impoverishment, were and are being reduced or raised to the same standard of life, forced to read the same books and share the same inconveniences. A sense of solidarity between all sorts of poor and propertyless men, as against the profit amassing and wealth concentrating classes, become more evident by the end of the 19th century. Old differences were fading away. The differences between craftsman and open-air worker, between black coat and overall, between poor clergyman and elementary schoolmaster, between policeman and bus driver, they were all fading away. They all had to buy the same cheap furnishings and live in similar cheap houses. I want to go back to this here, right? So one of the real changes in labor relations in the 19th century is indeed the rise of this bourgeoisie and this proletariat. And the bourgeois, as I mentioned, is a man who must look at his next door neighbor both as someone he must ingratiate himself with as a potential customer, and someone he must look askance at as a potential competitor. And this leads to the bourgeois psychology being profoundly suspicious. Well, you also have the rise of the proletariat. And the proletariat, they who own nothing, and the bourgeois, are both similar in one way, and that is they have no skills outside of the city. And we are all bourgeois, meaning we would die if we had to go into the woods and live for a couple weeks. We would die. People in earlier times had enough skills that they could get by. They could build a house. Most of us could not build a shack. If had we the tools, even a hatchet and some string, most people could not make a provision, excuse me, a sufficient shelter. Most people could not hunt or fish. This is a huge change in human relation. I'm talking the 19th century. Forget about now with the Wally Wally people floating around. Maybe I'm one of the Wally people. Um, but yeah, the ebbing away of skills, so that the bourgeois and the modern man, the proletariat, whatever, fundamentally have no actual skills outside of skills that they can sell to other bourgeois people. This has profound and deep psychic, and I would say spiritual ramifications in such societies, which increasingly obtain as time moves along. To the point you can say after World War II that everyone, everything is bourgeois. Um, so, I mean, basically, people without any skills or ownership, and that this section of the society grows and grows and grows till effectively becomes the entire society. A remarkable change in social relations. I'll say remarkably good, mind you. It was sometimes argued against Mark that the proportion of people who have savings invested had increased in many communities. These savings are technically capital, and their owners, therefore, technically capitalists to that extent. And this was supposed to contradict the statement of Marx that property concentrates into few and fewer hands. Marx used many of his terms carelessly and chose them ill, and his ideas were better than his words. When he wrote property, he meant property so far as it is power. So that's another distinctive feature of Marxism. So an understanding of power beyond just your typical civil offices. The small investor has remarkably little power over his invested capital. You know, your local entrepreneur is technically a capitalist, but cannot really be used in this sense, and cannot really be called a capitalist, because the power that your local coffee shop has, though the man, you know, technically owns all his capital, is nothing compared to the finance bros, let's say. Okay, so that's a look, and of course you've read the selections for today, selection 2 in the 19th century chapter. That's it for today with our look at, well, overall the 19th century and property relations, and then Robert Owen and Karl Marx, who represent two very different approaches to solving what they would consider the problem of labor and capital in their day. So tomorrow, we're going to look at Darwinism, and we'll probably pick up actually with this section number 3. We'll take a look. We'll see, looking at just the geopolitical situation of Europe at the time, seeing how that Holy Alliance is holding up. All right, so I'm going to down the bird here, and you're welcome to join us Monday through Friday. Typically this week there will be no class on Friday. We have to actually, at Apocatastastis, we have our summer hike and swim in New York, so I'm going to be leading that for LCN. But we will certainly get 4 good classes in, and we've knocked out 1 today, so how about that? Not too shabby. All right, thanks so much. I'll see you tomorrow. We look at Darwinism and the Holy Alliance. Take care now.